Well, we can, this is the one this is the normal kit. It's the same. Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, yeah, that's fine. Oh, that's good. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming back into the Holocaust School. It's been great just to hear some of your thoughts as you come back in from your workshop sessions. You may have noticed that the hall is a bit fuller than it was before, and that's because we have a number of people from the local environment, people who have been putting together these programs across various different synagogues here for a ceremony after you have left. But I'm sure that the refreshments you had are just as good as they're going to get. For all of those who we are honoured to host here this afternoon, those who have come here to give honour to the event that is Holocaust Memorial Day, for those many people who are involved in the delivery of this incredible enterprise that is put on within our synagogues, welcome to Northwood and Pinner Liberal Synagogue, and we are honoured to host you this afternoon. When you leave, please, if you go out the front, just turn left and just reflect as you walk by what is a very small garden. It has a leaf there, and we're grateful for two of the very committed members of the HMD team who've contributed to create this special space, which allows everybody to reflect when they walk into the synagogue and leave. It states, to remember those who died in the Holocaust, to honour those who survived, to tell their story. That second part is something that we have held incredibly dear. We are honoured to listen to Holocaust survivors come and give their testimony. We are honoured, and we do honour when we listen, and when we leave, reflect, and perhaps change just one aspect of our thought and our deed, so that in a way we become better people. It doesn't matter how experienced we might be as Holocaust educators, how many testimonies we may have heard or people that we have spoken to. Every time we experience what we will do this afternoon, we have the opportunity to change, to learn. It is why it is such a privilege for our synagogues, Northwood United Synagogue, Northwood and Pinner Liberal Synagogue, and all of the communities that have contributed to our programme, to host you, our guests, this afternoon. I will speak to you a little later, but I now hand on to Jonathan, who will MC this afternoon.
Aaron, thank you very much for those inspirational and uplifting words. I get to do the process bit, which is to say how extremely special it is now to have the opportunity, and what an enormous privilege it is, I think, for all of us to have the opportunity to listen to a personal account from Hannah Lewis, an amazing speaker who actually lived through the Holocaust. And process-wise, after Hannah's talk, students and teachers, you'll be able to ask your own questions. So it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce Hannah Lewis, MBE. Please give her a very warm welcome.
Thank you. Before we start, can you hear me? Because it's making a funny noise. Is it okay? Is the sound okay? No? Is it better now? No. Have I done something wrong with it? I did have my hair.
You did have your hair.
I did comb it.
You did. That wasn't the idea at all.
No, that wasn't the
You're
idea.
looking beautiful.
Is this on now?
I think it is, yes.
Can you hear me? Oh, I don't like newfangled things. As you've heard, my name is Hannah Lewis. I was born on the 1st of June. Yes? Yes? You can't see me? You want me to you want me up there? Okay. Can you see me now? Sorry, I thought you'd want to hear me rather than see me, but fine. Okay, let's start again. I was born on the 1st of June 1937 in a small market town in Poland on the borders of Poland and Russia. In fact, it was called Włodawa nad Bugiem, which means Włodawa on the River Bug. The other side of the town and of the river was Russia. The reason I have the photos that I'm able to illustrate what I'm saying is that because when my father and my grandfather realized that there was no escape, there was no place to go, they decided to bury a couple of suitcases of things that were relevant to our family. Amongst them, family photo albums, Friday night candlesticks, a dress my mother made me, a dress she made for herself. Nothing incredibly valuable, but very, very precious to me now. So, can we have the first photo? This is my father's family. My father was one of 3 children. Sadly, he was the only one who was completely fit and healthy and normal, because both his sister, my Auntie Hella, who I don't remember at all, and my Uncle Shulka were born deaf and mute. Nobody knew why or what, but that was the reality. My Auntie Hella disappeared way before I was born, and my Uncle Shulka, against all odds, met and married a very nice lady called Malka, and they had 1 child, my cousin Shlomo, and Shlomo was my best friend, the brother I never had, but he too was deaf and mute. There has never, I'm told that by the time my father was born, my grandmother and my grandfather were terrified that he too would be struck by this impediment, but he was plumb normal. My grandmother was apparently very spoiled. She was the only child of a wealthy merchant, and my father met her, my grandfather met her, when he came from Belarus looking for a job. And it was very simple. It was a very small town, half of which was probably Jewish and part of it was Polish. And though my father said there were the odd incidents and unpleasantness and maybe the odd pogrom, by and large, they coexisted quite well and life was good. When my grandfather married my grandmother, and after his father-in-law passed away, he expanded the business, and generally he was much more outgoing, and very often he would go both to Krakow and to Warsaw, not only to find out what was happening in the larger world, because Włodawa probably had two telephones, one on the priest's desk and one on the rabbi's desk. And the Jews in Włodawa amongst themselves spoke a very accented Polish, because amongst themselves they spoke Yiddish, strangely enough, a language which is very close to German. So it was very parochial. It was nice. On his journeys into the big towns, my grandfather used to go to a special meeting place where he met people, and very early on, apparently, he started coming back from these trips, worried about what was happening in the rest of Europe and the rise to power of a young man called Hitler. And like many other people, he thought that the family should move. He was, as I said, one of 6 children. 3 boys, of which he was the youngest, and 3 girls. All the 3 sisters left Poland sometime in the 20s. 2 with their husbands came to London, and 1 went, we always joked that Auntie Nellie was always a very ardent Zionist and was always going to go to Palestine. Not sure what happened with the navigation. She ended up in Detroit and married and had children and settled there. My grandfather couldn't persuade my grandmother to move. My father said he apparently kept on and saying we should move, and she said no one's going to start here. We're such a little town. And it was actually a very far-reaching decision, because by the end of the war, my grandmother was the only one to die of a heart attack in her own bed. Apart from my father and I, everyone else in the extended family had been murdered. Right, so you can see my father with his arm on his uncle's shoulder, my grandmother in the middle, my grandfather next to my uncle Shulka, and, that's fine. This is a photo of my mother. My father met my mother, the story goes, when she came to this store. It was not John Lewis, but she came to the store to buy shoes. And he said for him, it was love at first sight. And she was living with her father and some of her younger siblings because her mother had passed away. Everybody thought that when my father married my mother, my grandmother would be horrible or nasty or resent her. In actual fact, they became very good friends and they got on very well together. My grandfather was very concerned that the opportunity for leaving Poland was getting smaller and smaller. But again, there was no moving her, and somehow other people didn't move, and we stayed. Gradually, and I can't tell you that I really remember, because I was living at home with my parents, and my uncle Shulka and his wife, Malka, and my little, what I call brother, we all lived in the same house, and it was quite a big house with a big garden. And for me, nothing changed, except that our house and the Włodawa began to fill up with people that we didn't know. And again, I was only little. It didn't bother me, but it was a fact. And what in fact was happening is, as all the borders were closed and Hitler had invaded Poland, lots of people who lived in big towns tried to find comparative safety in smaller towns. So from our house being our house, it was full of people I didn't know. And then there were other odd things. There was a curfew. You couldn't go out when you wanted to go out. And my mother always held my hand very tightly when we went out. And food was scarce. And there was a German presence. And rumour followed rumour. And my grandfather heard that there were going to be 2 camps built very near to where we lived. Now, no one actually can envisage an extermination camp or a concentration camp or a forced labour camp. It wasn't part of one's normal vocabulary. But he also heard that the forced labour camp, or the labour camp, was going to be in a small little village called Adampol. And it just so happened that my family, my grandfather and my father, because my uncle Shulka worked with the family, but he was not capable of working outside those parameters because he couldn't hear and he couldn't speak. That the old man, who was the village elder, was going to be in some way involved in the camp. No one knew better. And whilst they still could, because there was a curfew and the net got tighter and you weren't allowed to go, there were people disappearing suddenly. One minute they were there, the next they weren't, and nobody knew where they were. It wasn't a happy time, but there was still this particular window. So they went to Adampol and they found the old man, and they asked him if it was true that there was going to be some kind of camp there. And my father said he was quite vague. He said, yes, some Germans had been a little while ago, and they said they would be coming there, and there would be work there, and they wanted him to, I think they wanted him to be a sort of a go-between, or it was by the time we went there, it was 43. So I suppose Russia would have joined the war. Maybe they were more careful about upsetting the Polish population, that he would be a sort of a go-between. Anyway, they took all their stuff, all the portables, and asked him, was it true? And he said, well, he'd seen them, but he didn't really know very much about it. And my father said they didn't have a lot of time to bargain, and he said to him, these are all our valuables. If we are sent to Adampol, I don't want anything else from you, but will you do your very best to save my 2 grandchildren? And the old man agreed, and to the best of his ability, I think he did that. The next one, please. I found this photo in my father's wallet after he passed away. I'd never used to show it, but I thought you'd like to see how I made my debut. And the next one. This was my cousin Shulka. Not Shulka, my cousin Shlomo. Shlomo and Shulka are too close together. I absolutely loved him. He was the nicest companion you can have. And as I said, his not being able to speak never got in the way. And I always was very protective of him. I always took him everywhere, and life without him was inconceivable. And again, I found that, and I decided to put it in. And if you look in the far corner, there are candlesticks. I still have these candlesticks. I brought them from Poland. And the next one, please. This is a photo that I probably put in out of kilter, but this is my Uncle Shulka and my grandfather when we were in Włodawa, but he was sent, but it was already the ghetto, and they were sent to work in a woodwork shop. It wasn't what they were used to, but that's what they did. So I've put this one in. I've actually had this in from the beginning. And the next one, please. This photo I will never forget. This was the day that we were rounded up. We had 1 hour to gather our belongings. And my father, who heard terrible stories about the various camps and things, didn't know where we were going. We didn't know if it would be Sobibor, in which case, if you were in Sobibor, you would have lasted maybe 2 or 3 days. It was an extermination camp. And I think it might have been one of the triggers for crematoria, because I read somewhere that one of the great problems was what to do with the bodies. They didn't know what to do with the bodies. There were too many people murdered daily. And the other one was Sobibor. I was born, as I said, just Sobibor, and then the other one was the work camp that we went to, forced labor camp. We didn't know where we were going, so we were just told to pack. I don't think I'd really understood it too well, but I knew it wasn't good news. My father went to get a wheelbarrow because he heard that if you lagged behind, if you tripped, they would kill you or they would club you to death. And he was worried that his father would not be able to make it. So he found a wheelbarrow whilst my mother packed, and the wheelbarrow came with us and it was used. Just as we were leaving, my mother wrapped around a shawl. I've still got it. It's dark red with little green leaves and pink flowers. And my father, as we were leaving, said, just wait a moment. And this was the last photo of me in our own house. We walked, and we ended up in Adampol, thank God. The next one, please. This was Adampol. My Uncle Shulka never made the first selection. He had a twitch, he didn't answer, he was taken out immediately, and we never saw him again. The men were separated from women, and my grandfather made the first selection, but he was killed by the first Einsatzgruppe sort of visit. Einsatzgruppe were specially trained groups who went and performed executions where it wasn't worth having them sent somewhere else, and it also worked wonderfully well in demoralizing everybody else and making them scared. The old man honored his pledge to my grandfather, and he asked the commandant that my mother and I and Shlomo be allocated to work on his farm, in his house. He had many barns and things. He had the biggest, as I said, the biggest farm. And he was living with his niece and her husband and their daughter, because as a bachelor, he couldn't have run it. It was a very primitive place. There was no running water, and there was no electricity. You had oil lamps. I can only describe the camp as a series of sheds, and I think they do look like sheds. Some of them didn't even have windows. Where the sentry was, there were windows. It was freezing in the winter, boiling in the summer, and we slept on what I can only describe as trays. But again, I wasn't that bothered because I was with my mother, and I still had Shlomo with me. And I learned to work, and work I did. I knew how to scrub a doorstep. I knew how to use a wringer. I knew when we went picking vegetables or potatoes how to do it. And I tried to help my mother as much as I could. I mean, obviously I was a bit of a nuisance with it because I wasn't that handy. And I have very vivid memories of my mother going to the well 5, 6, 7 times a day to draw water. You need water for watering plants. You need water for washing. I mean, when we turn a tap on, it's something we take for granted. But when you're lugging buckets of water it's a completely different thing. And I always looked after Shlomo. We had a code between us. If we were outside the parameters of the camp and we didn't have uniform, we wore whatever things we had. If I got hold of his hand and squeezed it, he knew he mustn't run, but he must hold my hand, and I would take him somewhere. And it happened not that often, but 2 or 3 times. This particular time, I was outside the house. I think I was tidying or washing the steps. I don't know what I was doing. My mother must have been inside the house. But I looked down the lane because I could hear clip-clop of horses. And I saw Germans, officers, were soldiers, on horseback. I didn't ever take chances. If there was time, I would take Shlomo's hand, squeeze it, and then he knew he mustn't run, and we would walk perfectly normally till we were out of sight, and then we would go into the nearest barn that we were at and dive into the straw. And we did it, not many times, but maybe 2 or 3 times. This particular time, my mother wasn't there to give instructions. I took his hand, I squeezed it, and he knew, so we started to walk till we were out of sight. And then we ran into the nearest barn. I dived into the hay towards the end, towards the bottom of the barn, and I thought he was following me. And when I felt around, and I could hear them outside, he wasn't there. So I had a little peephole, and I looked out, and for some reason, he was standing by the door, literally like this. And I didn't know what to do because I couldn't call him because he couldn't hear. And I could hear them outside. And as I said, they never, ever knocked on the door. They whacked the door open, and through a little peephole, I saw them pick him up by the scruff of his neck. I saw his feet kicking, and I never saw him again. And I think that's when the war really got to me. I missed him terribly, and I think I probably felt guilty for not grabbing him and making him do it. Gradually, everybody disappeared. My grandfather, as I said before, was killed by an Einsatzgruppe, and my father disappeared. But before he disappeared, he was very, very attached to his father, and he knew that the bodies would be incinerated. So he must have bribed somebody, because under cover of darkness, he got his father's body out of the trench before they could incinerate them, and with the help of his cousin, smuggled it into I've been to Adampol a couple of times since. It's surrounded by woods and by fields. And he told me that he managed to get a spade, and they took the body out in a sack under cover of darkness. They dug a hole, and they buried him. And they promised that if either of them survived, they would come back, disinter the body, and bury him in consecrated ground. The cousin didn't make it, but it's exactly what my father did. At some point, my father disappeared. He was probably on a work detail, disappeared, and joined the partisans. And the partisans had various things that they did. They tried to keep alive. They tried to find out when there were going to be Einsatzgruppen. My father told me they managed to blow up part of the Vordava-Helm railway so the transports couldn't get through. They found an ammunition dump. They took ammunition and blew up the rest so the Germans couldn't use it. And they were really also messengers. My mother and I were sort of isolated as more and more people disappeared. The old man had another niece who came to live with him. My mother was very scared of Zosha, always did as she was told. Sala was something else. She was a very beautiful young girl, and she was a great draw for all the German officers who were always coming into the house for, I don't know, just to talk to her, I suppose. And she was humane. She always tried to do good, and she was very good to my mother and I. As you can imagine, in a place like that, there's always some kind of disease, and typhus was rife. And I got sick, and I didn't get better. And my mother was desperate. And apparently she asked Sala, the nice niece, because it was so, so cold, whether just for one night we might sleep in the kitchen by the stove. They used to have stoves which were literally like a tiled wall with an opening inside. And my mother used to bake and cook in it, but it also kept warm during the night. So Sala asked her uncle, and he said yes. And that night my mother made up a sort of bed with straw and an old coat she had and bits and pieces. It was softer than the trays we slept in. And we settled down. But I was restless and she was restless. And sometime during the night, there was a tap, tap, tap on the little small side window in the kitchen. At first, I think we might have thought it was branches of a tree or something. It stopped, and then it started again. Finally, my mother realized somebody was tapping on the window. So she got up and she walked to the small window. And I remember she was trying to rub it because it was iced. And she couldn't. So she opened it a bit. And there in the moonlight was my father. He was wearing a black beret. I asked him after, did you have a black beret? And he said yes. They always wore very dark clothes if they could. And it was a very quick conversation. He said, Haya, you must come. Tomorrow there is an action. And she said, I can't. Hanechka's not well. And he said, bring her with. And she said, no, she'll never make it. And whether it was a searchlight or a patrol, I don't know. But all I know is she closed the window, he disappeared, and she came and she lay beside me. I was okay with her. I'd seen him, so it was nice to see him. But I don't understand how she got through that night, knowing what she knew. And I don't know how she made the decision she made. Because maybe if she had gone, they wouldn't have found me anyway. Or if I'd gone with them, I may not have survived anyway. It was a dilemma you wouldn't want to face. When morning came, the normal sounds of the Einsatzgruppe. The yells, the shrieks, the shouted commands, the odd shooting. They shot in the air just to get you scared. And we were just lying there. I don't know how long it was, but then there was this whack on the door. And my mother very calmly got on her knees, put her arms around me, gave me a huge hug and kiss, and then got up and very calmly walked to the door, opened it, and closed it behind her. And she didn't come back. So when she didn't come back, I decided I'd go and look for her. So I got up. The back of the house was the bit that faced the camp with the well in the middle, but the top end. And the stones were concrete. The steps of the house, the back of the house, it was on a slight slope, were concrete. And the snow was so icy that the ice was a real grey, a real dark grey almost. And I remember standing there trying to find her because there was such a mess going around there. And what my mother and I always did is we always made eye contact. But she wasn't looking at me. Anyway, I was just thinking that maybe I would go and take her hand as I always did. And somebody barked an order, and they started to shoot. And she was in the front row. There were 3 rows, I think, 2 or 3 rows. And I saw her fall, and I always say it. I saw her blood on the snow, and in that moment, I grew up. I knew I mustn't make a sound, and I knew why she wasn't looking at me. And I went back and put myself back on the pellet. When I came through, Sulla was looking after me. Very soon after, things changed. The camp was quite quiet. I was bereft, but I still went to and from the house. But then Sulla disappeared as well. It was an awful time, and I had one very narrow escape. Everybody had, usually I would go to the fields with Zosha and everybody, but this particular time they were going, and she said, no, you stay here and you do this, this, and this, and this. And so I did, but it was nice weather, and I found a ball of Zosha's, a rag ball, and decided to go and play with it. So I went to one of the barns near the house, and I was throwing the ball and catching it when I heard the sound of a clip-clop of a horse. And I turned round, and there was one lone German officer with dogs coming to the camp. One thing I learned was never to run, so I decided to stay where I was. He was probably going to go to the camp. So I threw the ball and caught it, threw the ball and caught it. He came just behind, but he stopped. So I didn't quite know what to do. And he had, as I said, Alsatians, and I've always been scared of Alsatians. I decided I could see myself, I should have had an Oscar for this. I'm catching the ball and throwing it, and he's still there. I don't know that it was as long as I remember, but it seemed like an eternity. And he suddenly barked out something, and the only word I recognized was Juden, Jew. So I decided to ignore it. But he didn't go. And again he barked out something with the word Jew. And I can still see myself catching the ball, turning round, looking at him. Because I never spoke Yiddish anyway, I spoke Polish. I turned around and I said, "No co chcesz? What do you want?" And he sat up. He didn't know what I said, but he knew that it wasn't, that it was Polish. He sat there for a while and he rode off. It was only when Zosha came back from the fields and looked at me and went as white as a sheet and said, "You here?" that I understood that she knew that they were coming. We were shelled very soon after. We were never liberated. My father walked, I don't know for how long, but found me. He said he never knew, he didn't know if I'd survived. I remember walking out of the camp and sitting on a stone with him. And in the end, I decided that maybe, I had to decide that my mother, maybe she didn't die because he was there, maybe he took her. And I said to him, "Where's Mama?" And he said, "Hanechka, you know Mama's not coming back. You saw it." And he said, for 2 hours I didn't utter a sound. We left Adampol. We went back to our home. It was full of other people. And after that, thank you. And after that, my father decided that whatever wasn't for us. Our house was full of other refugees. I think he dug up all the things that he had buried, and we ended up for one horrible winter in Lublin and then in Łódź. And everybody was trying to find somebody to take them out. Eventually, my father made contact with his 2 aunts who came to England. And they tried very, very hard to get me out, but it was too difficult. We're getting nowhere. But again, somebody had a hand in it, because one of the aunts lived next to or across the road from a family whose son was already trading with Poland. And when they came to Poland, they asked him to look us up. And because they were training, and I think there was probably a bit of bribery, on their 3rd visit, my visa came through. And I had 3 days to get together. My father came as far as the Czech border on the train, where he was dragged off, and I didn't see him for 9 years. And I arrived in England on the 31st of January 1949. I have to tell you, I didn't want to be here. I didn't want to learn English. I must have been a nightmare. But eventually, my father managed to get to Israel. I went to school. I made friends. Nobody ever asked me what happened. Not even after the war, not even family. It was as if I had some terrible disfiguration that it was kinder not to notice. So they didn't ask me. I didn't tell them. When we got married and we had children, my father came to visit a few times. He actually landed up living in Germany in the end, because the temperatures in Israel were so bad, and he'd had his head split open by the Germans. He couldn't take the heat. And I just made my new life. But 40 years later, we had the opportunity of going back to Poland, and it was quite a trip. We went to Łódź. The next one, please. That's the building that we used to live in. And I used to always play with the caretaker's daughter, because when my father went out and we were on our own, I was always scared of the dark. I wasn't scared of what I could see. I was scared of what I couldn't see. So I would stand at the corner of the road and yell for Mrs. Bulgainchik to open the door, and she'd take me in and she'd say, well, you can stay till your father comes. There was no one in our flat. There was no one in Mrs. Bulgainchik's flat. So we wandered around, and then at the last minute, I thought, we're just leaving, and I said to my husband, well, let's just try again. So I tried again. The next one, please. And a very scared young lady opened the door. It was the time of Solidarność, and they were very scared of everything. And Marek said, no, don't worry, she's okay. And I said to her, you know, I know it's a liberty, but I lived here, and I've come back with my husband, and I just wanted to show him where I lived. Can I show him round? I think, when I think about it, it's too idiotic. And she looked at Marek, and he said, no, she's all right. And I slept in a small little room off the kitchen. The kitchen now was a very nice drawing room. I mean, she made it beautiful. And she was fascinated that I knew where everything was. She said, do you know what this is? And I said, yes, this is the bath. And this is where the oven was. And she said, no, I've changed it. It was so familiar. And then I said to her, is there anybody who's been here longer than you? She said, well, they said the old couple next door used to be the caretakers here. So I said to Marek, please go and have a look. Knock on the door. And a few minutes later, the next one, please. The man between me and the other lady, I must have been looking down at something, because when I looked up, there he was, with his hands against the wall, as white as a sheet. And I said to him, do you know who I am? And he said, Hanechka, you haven't changed. You've just got bigger. Well, that was such validation. We went next door. This was Zosha, who I always played with, and Mrs. Bulgainchik. We spent a very happy hour with him, except that, of course, my husband didn't know what they were saying. And then we went to Włodawia, and that was an extraordinary thing as well, because when we got to Włodawia, we found the synagogue. The next one, please. Oh, this is Majdanek. Nobody ever goes to Majdanek, but it's a huge killing field that they only managed to develop a quarter of. And the next one. You can see there was me and us and the American crew. And the next one. This was the synagogue in Włodawia. We get to the synagogue in Włodawia, and I'm so excited to find it, except the interior is now a boat show. So I walk around. No one comes near me until I take my camera out, and as if shot from an arrow, this little lady next to me turns around to the guy, to our driver, and says, "You tell her she can't take photos." So I said to her in Polish, "Why not?" She said, "I don't know, but you can't take photos." I said, "Well, I lived round the corner. My parents were married here. I was blessed here." She said, "I'm sorry, I can't let you do the inside of the photo of the synagogue." But it started a dialogue. So I said to her, "Is there anybody else here who is Jewish?" She said, "Well, they say old Sarah's Jewish." I said, "Where's old Sarah?" And she tells me where it is. So we start our journey. The next one, please. This was my house. I found it. Sarah found it for me. And the next one. Yeah, I mean, I've never claimed it, but it was mine. So there's me there, again, outside it. And the next one, please. And that was Sarah. She's sitting on the porch, and she means business. And as we approach, I said to her, "Are you Sarah?" And she said, "And what if I am?" And I said, "Sarah, are you Jewish?" By this time, all her heckles are up. "And what if I am?" I said, "Well, if you're Sarah and you're Jewish, I'm looking for you. I'm Jewish. Come in, my child." So we go in and we sit down. And she said, "Well," she said, "you've come to see where your family comes from, don't you?" I said, "No, I come from here." She said, "You come from here?" "What was your family name?" So I told her. And she let out this scream. She said, "My God," she said, "you're Adam's child." And I said, "Yes." She said, "You don't know, but your father brought his father's coffin here overnight." I said, "Not only do I know it, I never slept till he came back." And then she showed us where our house was. She'd been at the wedding, and it was wonderful. It was validation. But then it was time to go to Adampol. By the time we got to Adampol, it was so small we drove past it 3 times. It was dusk. And we got there. The layout was exactly as I remembered it. I couldn't see the well. I saw the house that I worked in, but there was no one around, and I was at a loss. And then suddenly, a little old lady came out. Oh, yes, and in the distance, I saw 2 men by a tree, 2 yokels chatting to each other. And I said to Marek, "Go and ask them where the well is." And he goes to talk to them, and I'm watching, and I can see them shaking their head. Do you know, I was in such a white rage. I'd waited 40 years, and he's telling me it's not there. I got out of the car and ran towards them, at which point an old lady came out looking for her grandson. She ignored me. She said, "What does she want?" He said, she's talking about a well. I told her there's no wells. And she looked at me very carefully, and she said, "Why do you want to know about the well?" I said, "I was here in the war." She said, "There were 2 wells here. One," I said, "No, not the one by where you've now got the petrol pump. The one between the camp and the village." She said, "Come with me." The next one, please. And we walk up. You can see the back of me. And we stop in front of this. And I said, "What is it?" She said, "Open it." So I opened it. I didn't fix it again. And I look in, and there is my well. It's in the position that it was, with the 2 buckets still on it. And I said, why did they tell me there was no well? She said, well, most people don't know what it is. She said, but we covered it in because the village children used to try and play with it, or in it. And then she said, what else do you remember? We sort of had a dialogue, and maybe she even remembered me. I said, I remember a funny smell of burning in the middle of the night one night. And she said, oh yes, that was, I'll tell you what that was. She said, do you see this line here? And in my mind's eye, I readjusted myself, because that's where my mother was standing. And she said, after it was on the way to the well, but it was not quite in the middle, slightly to the side. And she said, when the Germans were leaving, they disinterred where they had buried everybody, where they'd thrown them in, and they burnt the bodies. So she said, that's the smell you smelt. So I thought, right. And then she said, what else do you remember? And I said, I remembered Salah. Maybe she remembered me, I don't know. But she went inside, and then I looked back. I looked to the house. It was painted, but the steps were still exactly the same. And I ran up those steps, and I looked back to where the well was, where the camp was, and in a way it was my validation. I knew that everything was where I said it was, slightly changed, and what happened had happened, and I know it happened because I had been there. Thank you. Do you have any questions? I don't believe I've got a going home present. Thank you so much. That's lovely. Thank you. Thank you. I like presents.
Let's see if we can kick off the Q&A session. I think you've had the comment earlier in the day that normally the Q&A session is a bit that really flies. It's where it really comes to life. Hannah's talk, I'm sure I speak for everyone, has been absolutely fascinating. I've had shivers going up and down my spine for the last 45 minutes, and Hannah, we couldn't hear a pin drop. So I'm sure there are lots of questions. It's always a little tricky asking the first one, but who's going to be first? Please raise your hand, and when Peter gets to you with the microphone, thank you, stand up, mention your name, and then ask your question.
This is on? Okay. So, first of all, first of all, thank you very much for sharing your experiences and the history behind this, well, the very riveting tale. But my question is, what exactly deterred your father from going to the Soviet Union whereas he came over to Great Britain?
When to go to the Soviet Union?
Why didn't he go to the nearby Soviet Union? Why did he come over to... So why didn't he go over to the Soviet Union? Why did he come over to Britain? Exactly.
He actually went to Israel. He stayed in Poland, but it was very hard for him. And he made his way to Israel. And after Israel, he wouldn't want to be in Russia. He wasn't Russian, he was Polish. So he wanted to stay in Europe, and I think he stayed wherever. It was very difficult because there were so many refugees that everything was almost people on the move. So you went where you could get a passport and live. And there was quite a big Jewish German population there, well, comparatively, who went back. So in the end, he was more comfortable. He didn't speak Russian, he spoke Polish.
Who has the next question?
My name is Freddie Burdack. I just wanted to ask you, how old were you when, sadly, your mother was shot in the snow? How old would you have been at that stage?
Probably 7.
Amazing.
Just bordering on 7.
Yes.
I would have been 7 that birthday.
Amazing.
But I, in a way, I used to say that we were children without a childhood. But actually, that's not true either. We were children, and that was our childhood. And it was just where we were.
Thank you for sharing that with us. Thank you.
Not at all.
Thank you very much, Hannah. My name is Agata Eichten. Today I represent Watford Borough Council, but I'm Polish. So let me say in Polish, Dzień dobry, Haneczko.
Dzień dobry.
Bardzo serdecznie dziękuję za tą historię. I would like to thank you very much from the bottom of my heart for your story that you shared with us. I not even inspired, but I know the places where you talked about it. I'm absolutely touched by your story, and I'm very proud of you that you was able to make it to England, and even if it was so difficult for you. I share my love and sympathy with you. Dziękuję ci bardzo. Thank you.
Thank you. Dziękuję ci.
Hi Hannah, my name is John. I'm one of the chaplains up at the Mount Vernon, and I'm so privileged to have had the invitation to be here today. So privileged and deeply touched by the enormous amount of young people that are here, because it's these young people that are going to bring these stories on, and they're going to make sure, I know, that people, the legacy of the tragedies in the past will be remembered to save tragedies in the future. But there was something you mentioned earlier about the Oscar when you were playing with the ball. Well, you should probably have another Oscar for this afternoon. But what I'd like to say is, what other things, Hannah, what other childish things did you do to detract from the horrors that were around you at the time? What other things did you and the other children do to escape that, to find somewhere solace and love between yourselves?
I didn't really mix very much with other children because children didn't last very long. I think I was very lucky to have survived. I nearly always played with Shlomo. I think all sorts of things were, if it was quiet in the camp, that was good. If you wasn't too cold and you were comfortable, that was good. If you had more to eat, that was great. If I went picking fruit or picking whatever, and I managed to find an apple or something, that was also great. I think there wasn't any sort of planning for it. And I don't know that I was proactive. I think I was reactive. I reacted to a situation. And I think the things that that made me happy was probably if there was no atrocity or no horror happening. I think as a child you don't have strategic planning. You sort of go from place to place. And I think one thing I learned is to trust my own instincts. And to this day, I mean, I can be as scatty as anyone. If I have a premonition about something or a feeling about something, I don't automatically feel that whatever anybody else feels is better than me. I don't think I'm better than them, but I don't have that kind of doubt about myself. I don't think I'm always right, but I also don't think I'm always wrong, if you know what I mean.
Hi, thank you. My name's Anita Gross. I've come from Berkshire, and really appreciate you sharing your story today. Thank you. I also have a family history of survivors. But one of the things that I wondered if you could talk about a little bit more, which struck me, was your use of the word validation several times in your story. And I just wondered if you could explain about why you felt this need for validation and what it means to you.
Well, first of all, when I was in Poland, I was with everybody who was my circle, not necessarily the Poles, who'd been through a similar experience. When I came to England, as I said, nobody ever asked me. So it was something that was shelved. And it was difficult. And so for me, when life became good, and I had a lovely home, and I had lovely children, and I had a good marriage, it was, the two sides were so different. The way I lived and what I could have and what I could give my children that my mother couldn't give me. So that's what I mean by it. It's validation that A, I'm carrying on what she would have wanted me to carry on, and that they didn't break me, because sometimes people who go through a trauma, I have met people who never had children because they felt they couldn't bring children into this world. And I didn't feel that. I felt I wanted to have a family. I wanted my mother's sacrifice to matter, to actually to do what I think she would have wanted me to do, but I wanted to do it too, because I had very nice memories of family. So I wanted to replicate it.
Fred, we only have time for one more. We've got time for two more questions.
My name is Rich Blakelob. I'm pastor of Baptist Church. Again, thank you for sharing your experiences and your story. Someone already said it's great to see so many young people here. And I know when I was in school growing up, we heard that the Holocaust happened, but we didn't learn very much about it. And I only heard firsthand from a Holocaust survivor a year ago. And hearing your story, my children are the age that you will have been. And I think it's fantastic that you and other survivors are sharing your story so that we can learn what would be, if there was one lesson, perhaps, that yes, those that are in school, but those of us also that are a bit older could learn, and that we would take away from today. What would be the one thing that you would want us to learn from your experiences? Thank you.
I'd like them to learn tolerance and respect for the other, and to trust in themselves, and to know that things can get better, that it doesn't have to be a spiral down. Sometimes it is, not because you're not clever or you're clever, but just because it happens. But when I look at